Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me is Z. This is the Easter edition, I guess, of the podcast. Happy Easter to anyone who celebrates that for Easter weekend.
Or Easter next week for those doing the Greek Orthodox calendar.
Oh, today I learned. I didn't even know there was a different Easter for them.
Yeah, I believe this weekend is now I can't think of the name of it. Whatever starts the week before Easter.
Oh, okay. Before we jump into topics, we do want to mention we have been getting transcripts done. Z's been working on that. So you'll find on our blog, the transcripts are up for the last episode, and all the episodes going forward are going to have transcripts as well. They're not perfect. They're automatically generated.
Far from perfect. I will say that right now. Like since I do have it on screen, you can see on here there for anybody it's from Song Go, is what Spectre said very early on, and when he introduced me, it's so I'm Spectre with me as E. So, I've got a new
Your
name.
name is kind of weird. I can't blame you for that.
So it did during my test runs actually get Z correct when I gave it the hints for it. Okay. But regardless, I mean, it's definitely not good, but there's enough there that, you can control F for something of interest if you want. Links to the video on the side to get what we actually said about something. Just trying to be there for those of you who don't really want to listen to all 2 hours, but maybe want to find a particular topic. It's in there. It's probably not going to get any more accurate anytime soon. This is already using like Google's speech to text stuff, using their premium versions of it. So this is probably as good as it's going to get for a while until somebody actually wants to manually do it.
What I found kind of funny about the transcripts was, for some reason, it seems Google Speech seems to think me and Auntie are the same person. It'll kind of put our statements together, like it'll put stuff that Auntie says under my name.
Yeah, well, so at the end of statements, actually, so it kind of happens on this one here. It starts off that we covered on Facebook research when I was talking about last episode about Facebook research. That we was something I said, not you. So it does seem to have some delay in there. Nonetheless, we just want to mention, like, transcripts are there. All the episodes going forward will have a link to the transcript at the bottom.
Yeah. So with that being said, we'll jump into some topics. So we're going to kind of revisit something here. A little while ago, we talked about corp.com. There was a Krebs article on it back in February, and how Microsoft was basically kind of being extorted in a way to try to buy it for $1.7 million.
That was episode 28.
Yeah.
For anybody who wants to look back at what we commented.
Yeah. So the reasoning for that is, internal corporate networks will try to send like credentials and data to corp.com due to defaults from all the way back in the 90s. And the guy who owned it, Mike O'Connor, he had it for 26 years and was trying to sell it for $1.7 million. And it seemed originally Microsoft wasn't going to buy it. They offered $20,000 for it like many years ago, but it didn't go through. Well, it seems Microsoft actually has now kind of bit the bullet and bought it. So, just kind of a follow-up to that story we covered a little while ago. I think it's pretty cool.
I mean, I still kind of think it feels very much like extortion. At the same time, I mean, the fault here is, like, it is Microsoft's fault for choosing to use corp.com as their default rather than, there are reserved and special use domain names. .invalid should always give you an NX domain response. .localhost is reserved, RFC whatever for it. Should always return the loopback address. .test. Like, there are options here that could be used. That said, maybe it wasn't at the time. I actually don't know when those RFCs came into play. But at least, in future updates, it should have been changed.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're kind of in agreement that they shouldn't have had to, but at the same time, $1.7 million is kind of a drop in the bucket for Microsoft, and I think it's still a good move by them, protect their customers and stuff like that. So,
it's a good move for them, but I just can't really stand behind the guy also trying to sell it for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, annoying on that part, but overall, it worked out, I think.
Yeah, I mean,
This is
like I
probably
said,
the best
it's a
outcome
drop
that
in the
could have come out of
bucket.
it.
So, I mean, like, I do think Microsoft should have bought it earlier.
Yeah.
We talked about this. I mean, it just feels very much like extortion on that. Saying how he's going to sell it if Microsoft doesn't buy it. I can get him trying to get rid of it, but yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, we like I said, this was episode 28. We spent a fair chunk of time talking about it, actually.
Yeah, so you can go back and get the full conversation on that if you want a bit more insight into that. But we'll move on. So usually when we cover the COVID-19 stuff that's going on, it's usually in a negative light with things being canceled and stuff like that. But we're going to bring some positive news around it. And that's that HackerOne is starting a little campaign where you can actually donate bug bounty payouts or a split of them directly to the WHO COVID-19 response fund.
Yeah, so I didn't realize, but this is actually kind of old news. So I wasn't familiar with this aspect. With HackerOne, you can set collaborators when you have a bounty. You can set who your collaborator was, and then you can split the bounty.
Which is pretty cool.
And there's a particular user, Hack for Good, which will split your bounty with a charitable organization or with some charity. So this month, it happens to be the WHO and their COVID-19 response fund. But that changes every month. So it's not necessarily a new feature. It's just that the Hack for Good this month is in particular on the WHO's response fund.
Yeah. So like you were saying, it works through their built-in collaborator system. You just add the user for that and set the ratio you want to split to donate and invite them to the report. Not all bounties support collaboration, but in those cases, you can email them to set it up as well. I do have some questions around it, though. I'm guessing this is all up to the researcher, since ultimately they're the ones getting paid. But if it just has to do with inviting a collaborator, could vendors split researcher payouts forcefully, I wonder? I
imagine
that submitted something through HackerOne, so
I don't think vendors can necessarily do it forcefully. There probably is a means that they could have some agreement with HackerOne. That said, I mean, this also feels like when companies do this, it always feels a little bit cheap to me. So it's not that this is a bad thing in any sense, but at the same time, HackerOne is basically just making it easier for you to donate, but you donate through them, so they get the tax write-off.
That's a good point.
That's why companies do this. Like, you're able to place the donation through them. It's the same thing like supermarkets when they ask you to donate. They're donating that money. They get the tax write-off for it. You just, get to donate, conveniently. So, I mean, imagine if HackerOne were to decide, if this was... Because this was important enough for them to put out the blog post about who this month's... Now, and actually, I guess to be fair, I don't know if they put out this, every month a blog post with it. I don't recall seeing similar blog posts in the past, because HackerOne is one of the blogs that I follow for this. But assuming they don't, they found this one to be of particular importance to mention this option to donate. Imagine if they were to just take off the top, a percent of their cut, rather than saying, researchers had to give out of their cut, but HackerOne was just going to donate 1%. That would have a much greater impact. They're just saying, take your money, you can donate through us.
Yeah, ultimately the money is coming out of the researcher's pocket, not the vendor's or HackerOne's pocket. Yeah, and they, like you're saying, they are getting the write-off. So maybe not as much of a positive light as I initially thought, but that is.
It's so things like this. Though, to be clear, they do add a convenience factor to making the donation. There are definitely going to be people that wouldn't have donated otherwise. So it is getting money. Same thing with the supermarket system. Just having it so convenient and right there leads to more people donating. It does actually help with that, so it is a good thing. It's just, it always feels like a little bit of a scam to me when I see these things.
Yeah, my bigger worry was that point I brought up earlier with, I'm wondering if vendors could forcefully split the payouts. I honestly don't think that would happen. I think that would be
I don't think they could. I mean, I don't know what their side looks like for that, but...
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of wondering. Like, obviously, we don't have insight into that because we don't have a HackerOne bounty running, so I don't know what the vendor view of that looks like, but it was just something I was kind of thinking about.
Yeah, fair
You
enough.
know, if anybody is running like a HackerOne program, feel free to let us know if, I'm off base about that. But that was just something I kind of was thinking about.
Well, I mean, that functionality seems like something that would be more based on the researcher to say who their collaborator is, not a vendor to say you collaborated with this person, even if you didn't.
The only reason, like, I think along those lines too, but I'm also thinking vendors might not want people just arbitrarily inviting collaborators in. So I'm wondering if they might have at least some sort of influence on that. But I don't know. Yeah, it was just something, it's not something I can say concretely one way or the other. But it's been a while since we've had some releases, and we have one right now, and it's the RetDec decompiler, and it's hit version 4.0. So for those of you that don't know about RetDec, it's a decompiler based on LLVM, and it supports like a variety of architectures. It supports x86, 64, ARM, PPC.
Well, so 64 is one of the newer things.
ARM64 is one of the newer things, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it also supports like other file formats like PEs, ELFs, MACOs. So it supports like a lot of stuff. But with 4.0, like you were just saying, it's added even more support. They have support for ARC64. They added support for JSON output, and they have a more modular build system. So it's easier to work with.
It's the build system that I'm kind of most excited about. So I've used RetDec actually for quite a while. It was kind of my go-to decompiler. When I didn't have access to IDA. So early on, it was basically a web interface. You could upload a file and it'll do the decompilation. They had an API also that actually tied in. There's an IDA plugin you can use. So when they open sourced this, I think it was like, I want to say a few years back, like maybe 2017, 2018, they open sourced it. It was an exciting thing because now, it would become a lot more useful. The reality, though, was it was an absolute pain to use. The new build system seems like it should make that easier. They basically, Spectre already mentioned, made a lot more modular. They swapped out or got rid of all the shell scripts for Python scripts. Hopefully will be an improvement. I haven't been able to try it yet, but I'm hoping that'll kind of improve the usability of it. And I think the JSON output is an interesting thing they've added. Instead of just being able to pull out the actual decompilation, they basically got all the tokens that puts that in a JSON form. So if you want to process with something else, you don't need to reprocess the decompiled output. It's already done that for you. Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of removing really nice. One step, but it makes it a lot more usable for the machine.
I will say that's really nice just because I don't know if you'd want to argue with me on this point, but I'd say JSON is probably the best non-binary serialization format. So I really like when things have JSON support, especially for something as useful as like the decompiler.
So I mean, it's more than just the JSON support here, though. It's the fact that it's a JSON support of all the tokens that it generated. I mean, I think that's kind of the key thing there. Having those tokens, already having it tokenized. Just because otherwise, if it just outputs file, you do expect a decompiler to output source code. You do expect it to output that, not JSON. The fact that you don't have to do that step, you get more accuracy out of it. I think that's kind of a net positive for if you want to integrate this as just a step in a further workflow. They've made that a lot easier to do.
Yeah, basically they made it so you can skip the step of parsing, like writing a lexical parser yourself. It basically does that part for you, which is really awesome because doing lexical parsing is like it is quite complex. The other part that's pretty cool that they added is they actually have a library for it now too. They have like an official library for it. So, and I think it has like bindings for a lot of the popular languages like Rust, C, Golang. So I think it's got a lot of those bindings if I remember right from when I looked at the GitHub for it. I'd say the library is probably the coolest part. I did want to ask a question though, because you were saying you've used RetDec a lot. I haven't really used it. How does it compare in like how accurate it is compared to like hex phrase or slay, for example?
So I haven't done really a really good comparison there. So I
Okay.
was using it. One of the reasons I was using it is because it's for MIPS, which IDA didn't. Um, or actually, I'm not even sure if IDA does. Well, yeah, I don't know if IDA does support MIPS yet with the decompiler, but
There's probably a plugin for it or something, but
perhaps.
probably
Like
not
I'm
official.
not
Yeah.
sure. Either way, and I haven't had a chance to play around with Ghidra's decompiler and MIPS stuff, so I can't really say how good or bad it was.
Okay.
Because this was working on some PS2 stuff when I was using it.
But in your experience using RetDec, was
It
the
was
like
better than
type information
Snowball.
fairly accurate?
Well,
Low bar though.
so again, I was working on PS2 stuff.
Yeah.
Like I couldn't expect it to have the library stuff. Like I couldn't expect it to know all of that. So, I can't even compare on that. It was
That's fair
it
enough.
was definitely sufficient for what I was doing, and like I said, better than Snowball.
It could be something fun to look at, on a stream, just trying to compare like the decompiler output of RetDec compared to Slay and possibly hex phrase. I don't know if we'd want to do hex phrase, but
I mean, I think there'd be. This is kind of actually leading up, I think, into something that we'll get in the next topic, but I do think that's something we could do. Actually, more of a tool comparison with Binary Ninja, Ghidra, IDA, and I guess maybe RetDec.
Ninja, we don't have the decompiler yet, though. So
Not yet, but I mean, just a tool comparison in general. But yeah, no, I think we could do something with that.
Taking a chat, apparently Snake says that hex phrase does support it, yeah.
Okay, then either the support came after I was working on it, or I just didn't have that decompiler, since I know you have to. I can't think of why my work would have needed the MIPS decompiler, so I could imagine it also just wasn't paid for. Either way, I didn't have it through Hexrays, is what I'll say.
Yeah. So, this looks pretty cool. I probably will end up taking a look at this personally for maybe some like projects I'm working on and stuff. So, definitely wanted to bring that up. It does seem like there's been a lot of good like quality of life improvements and
4.0, we don't cover the releases too much anymore compared to the first episodes, but this one I thought was a bit of a standout.
Yeah. So, we've been talking about IDA and hex phrase, so we'll get into IDA Home. So Ilfac, about a week ago or so, teased the coming of IDA Home, which was said to be a product that would address common community concerns around IDA, which you could tell right away at the price point, because the future set of IDA is pretty good. It's just far too expensive for most people. So, this got some hype. People were thinking maybe we'll get IDA with a decompiler for one architecture for a reduced price or something like that. And it ended up being a disappointment. It basically ended up being IDA free, but with IDA Python and debugging support for $365 a year.
Not even IDA free, because you only have one processor family.
So it's even worse than IDA free.
But I mean, you're basically paying for the IDA Python. Is basically what you're paying $365 a year for, and you only get the annual payment. There's no monthly option with that.
And that's not worth it. Not even close.
64-bit applications also. I don't know. Does IDA free support 64-bit yet?
I think since 7.0 it does.
Okay, so
yeah.
So then that's not new. You do get the debugger, which I don't think is in free.
It's not. At the same time, maybe I'm a bit biased here, but I absolutely do not like IDA's debugging front end anyway. So I don't know what the common opinion is on that, but I do not like IDA's debugging capabilities, and I never use it. So
yeah, which is fair. I mean, I think it comes down to different use cases. I feel like it's a lot more useful for people that are doing like reverse engineering on something like, doing malware RE, where you've got it running on some foreign system using the network interface to do the debugging. Oh no, I feel like with RE it might have a little bit more use than just with exploit development.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, ultimately what it comes down to, though, is you're getting debugging in IDA Python for $365 a year. It seems we're not alone. I think all the community feedback I've seen on it seemed to be exclusively negative. I don't know if I saw one positive comment on it.
I saw some defensive IDA, but here's the thing. This really just feels like it's too little, too late.
Yeah.
is kind of the feeling I got from this. And I was thinking about this because I was going to do some responses. I mean, I saw this on Reddit, so I was going to get involved there. But, the thing is, what I realized is I don't think IDA has ever really had the goodwill of the community. IDA has always been something, as far as I've noticed, it's kind of just been something you begrudgingly have to use because it was the best thing available. But nobody really liked Hexrays as a company. Nobody really liked the fact they were overcharging for it. And I mean, as far as I can tell, everybody's felt like they've been overcharging for this. They've had the market dominance and they've done nothing with it, which is kind of the other thing. I mean, there isn't a lot that you can kind of push with IDA that says, or that shows how IDA has really innovated. I think at best you can pull out, the win graph, the whole graphing system. I'm not sure this was before my time. I know the win graph itself came in somewhere in like the 4 dot something era, so like early 2000s. And I don't know if they were the first to do the graphing view or not. But I mean, that's as close as I think you've come to really saying they had any innovations.
The only thing that's happened in like the last like couple major version numbers is undo. And it's literally like it's undo. Every other application has it. So it's not really that innovational, I don't think.
Yeah, out of chat, Razzie Wu mentions, do they have big institutional clients? Might explain why they don't care about individual customers. And yeah, that's kind of the big thing is the professionals are using this. Professionals use IDA. That's the main tool. That, I do think there's a bit of a shift. But that was kind of my point. Like, it's something, they just use it. You're paying for the support also. You do get that support, which, of course, large clients do want to have, somebody they can call if something breaks type thing. Or get bug fixes in there compared to waiting for, like, open source with Ghidra or something. You put in a issue and maybe it'll get fixed, maybe it won't.
Or fix it yourself.
Yeah, I mean, you can do that. But so that is a big thing for IDA. They do have the market dominance. But what I was kind of getting is I don't feel like they've really innovated. They haven't really taken any good steps with that. And to be fair to them, they have had kind of that constant incremental upgrades. So I actually did go and look through the change log just to see if maybe I was missing something. And people are definitely welcome to correct me on this. But as I was just kind of stepping through kind of the major releases and looking at the release information, there wasn't a ton. Like, 6.0, the big thing was the new GUI was using Qt. And I think that might have been 6.0 I pulled up. Yeah, 6.1 though, it was like Android support, UTF-8 support. 6.2, they had a GUI installer. Things like that, like, especially jumping back on 6.1 with the font stuff, or with the text parsing. Like, okay, that makes sense to do. It's just nothing really stood out at any point as really being all that innovative in the last, 10 years. Maybe I'm mistaken on something. Maybe I just missed it. Got stuck in my ways, only using the features I use, and that's it. But on the other hand, though, you've got Ghidra, which... Again, I mean, I'm not sure what I really pull as being really innovative with them, but they do have a good compiler. They don't have the debugger, but what I will point out is Binary Ninja. In the same price point as IDA Home, has plenty more offerings in terms of the features. Support. Yeah, but the big thing in terms of like innovation is that intermediate language, the BNILs. Which right now they have the low level, the mid level. Soon enough, they've been teasing it on Twitter, is they'll have the high level, which is effectively their decompiler. But so, at least Binja, you've seen something new coming up, something that's actually trying to innovate a bit. And the ILs, I think, are a really great idea. If you're not familiar with what the intermediate languages are, basically the first one, the low level IL is... actually, I'll just pull up a page with a sample here.
And one thing I will say about the ILs while you're pulling that up is what also makes them really good is they have strong built-in plugin support too. So like you can make plugins that can interface with the IL like very easily. That is one like big thing with Binja is the plugin API is extremely strong and consistent, unlike IDA's as well.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I
you
mean,
were just going to show.
the plugin API and stuff, it's effectively a first-class citizen here within Binary Ninja. But yeah, I was just going to pull up like the low-level IL, basically just rewriting your assembly instruction to something that's just slightly more readable. Breaks out the conditionals, breaks out the flags that are used, and just rewrites that as a very simple, like if rax u greater than 0xe. And shows you like the if and else. Like it just does some really simple rewriting of it. The mid-level one goes just a little bit higher, giving you variables, giving you some of the function calls, just some basic ideas there, but it's really useful when you're just scanning the instructions to be able to look at that. And then on the other hand, instead of having the decompiler, the ILs, at least, on the low-level IL, it's very unlikely to be lying to you about what anything's doing, whereas compilers definitely make wrong assumptions. So you can jump through these different levels, and, once they have a decompiler, something doesn't quite make sense, you jump back, you look, in the medium level one, you could see it's actually not creating this structure. You don't have to jump all the way back to the assembly. It's a little time saver.
You get 4 views instead of 1, or 2, sorry.
Yeah, and so I just add, with Binary Ninja, it's something new that they've actually innovated with. It's something new from them. IDA does not offer any sort of IL to use. I don't think Ghidra offers anything like that either, unless maybe through a plugin, but not that I'm aware of. So just in terms of trying to innovate, at least Binary Ninja is one, they're cheaper, 2, they are actually making some attempt to innovate with what they're doing. So I mean, at the price point...
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, at the price point, the personal student version of this is half the price of IDA. More support, although on that note, it's not multi-threaded. I think, do you have a personal license, Spectrum?
I have a personal, yeah. I don't have a commercial.
So how has the performance been kind of with large files? Because that is something IDA does pretty well with large files. Ghidra, still not great.
It's not been too bad. The initial analysis speed and stuff like that is a bit slower, but it's gotten better because initially Binary Ninja Personal didn't have analysis caching. So each time you loaded a binary, it would have to do the analysis phase every time. They've actually changed that though. In the last year or so, I think they've added analysis caching to the personal version as well. So there is a bit of that. It's kind of like Ghidra in a sense. There's a bit of a overhead on the initial analysis time, but once that's done, the Binary Ninja database file is built, and then it's when you open it in the future, all that stuff's already done for you. So it's not that bad, honestly. And and on that point, I don't think IDA is multi-threaded either, is it?
Oh, I don't know if it's multi-threaded, but I know IDA has generally at least seemed to have better performance when it comes to large files.
Yeah, okay.
I won't make any claims about how it's implemented, just... I think generally speaking, that's been one of the challenge points, is how does it handle large files?
Yeah. Going back a bit to what you were saying earlier with IDA being that thing that you kind of have to use, I would say IDA is almost like the Photoshop of reverse engineering in that respect. Not everyone likes it. It's the industry standard. But unlike Photoshop, we are seeing competition come to it. And I think that is, that kind of answers the question of why now? Why are IDA kind of trying to push for this? I think it's safe to say Ghidra, as well as Vector 35 announcing that decompiler coming for Binja, like you were talking about earlier, could be spurring that on a little bit. And I've also been noticing that people in the industry are starting to switch. Even people in these companies you were talking about earlier, I've been seeing that they've been switching to Ghidra or Binary Ninja, and that's where their big license money comes from, is from those companies.
Yeah, and
so
that's not going to disappear.
Companies are going to switch.
I don't think that's going to disappear too quickly, but I do agree. I'm seeing that shift of people moving away. And it comes in a few different ways. Obviously, there's kind of newcomers to the field. IDA isn't getting recommended as strongly anymore. Just plain and simple. The IDA book used to be one of the standard recommendations for books. In addition to reversing the secrets of reverse engineering and stuff. The IDA book was just something that you'd also pick up. Why? Because you're going to be using IDA. It was just a given. That has definitely changed in the last several years. There's definitely been a push where people just aren't, like, IDA's still kind of considered the best option, but you're sufficient with Ghidra, you're sufficient with Binary Ninja or other more affordable options. And from that, with newcomers to the field starting to use those other tools, eventually, they become professionals. They're not using IDA. So over time, I think we can see IDA becoming relegated to those kind of like Perl, those people that have used it all the time and never really moved on. But those are kind of keeping up. Yeah, I've noticed the same thing. People are starting to move away. It's not in huge numbers. It's not like flocks of people are just suddenly not using IDA. And even when they are, it's usually like they still have an IDA license, but their daily driver is something else. And so, I don't know, I just get the feeling that IDA's time is limited, especially if we keep seeing improvements coming.
Which I think we will.
I do
Binary
too.
Ninja's end. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely excited with Binary Ninja and what they've been doing. But Ghidra too. At the same time, it is going to be a slow thing. We're not just one day going to see one day soon just see IDA completely unused. Like I mentioned, the support, the enterprise customers. It's had such a market dominance for a while. It's going to take a while for that to disappear. But personally, after I last lost my IDA license for my last job, I kind of sat back and thought do I want to go and pay for one myself? Or I just kind of came to the realization myself that I just don't want to support IDA as a company.
No, I'm the same way.
So they're probably never going to sponsor us now, but that'll happen anyhow. But
they would sponsor us anyway.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just, I kind of realized that as a company, they've never really had that goodwill. They've just kind of been, the dominant force, so you have to use it. That said, I think Binary Ninja, definitely kind of part of the community, interacts with the rest of the community and stuff. I mean, I could get behind them. That said, before I know we're behind a Gangstar to pull us off, I do want to kind of just plug in this IDA section a new book coming out, the Ghidra book. I had mentioned the IDA book. So the Ghidra book's coming out supposedly July 2020. So if you use the coupon code, so this is nostarchpress, nostarch.com/Ghidra book, and you can use the code right now, Operation, for 40% off. So I'll just plug that in with the IDA stuff if you want to look at something other than IDA.
Yeah, I guess I'll just kind of end off with I'm sitting here wondering if IDA, or rather Hexrays, will ever sort of come down to earth with the community. It seems they've always been so detached. It's I don't know if they're ever gonna.
I mean, they're going to have to, I think, eventually.
Yeah, they might be forced to. You're right.
But at the same time, moves like this are just, they're doing too little and they're doing it too late.
It just shows how much they
it's too reactionary.
I think part of the reason that it kind of a lot of people were upset about it is they directly said it would address community concerns, and the fact that it didn't, it's it just shows how detached they are. It's
they're out of touch with.
They're out of touch, yeah.
What the actual community wants.
Yeah. That being said, I think we'll move on to Sandboxie. Sandboxie went open source. So Sandboxie it's very old software. If you were using computers in the 2000 to 2010 range, you've probably heard of it or used it at some point. And it's basically sandboxing software to allow you to run programs inside of a containered environment. It was very popular on forums and stuff like that I was on, because people were downloading tools and they wanted to be on the safe side, so they'd download Sandboxie and run those tools in that. And
I mean, Sandboxie was it's a file system sandbox in terms of what it does. It's basically it doesn't write out to your file system. It'll write everything that the program tries to do. It'll write out kind of an overlay that's then placed over the file system. That way, you delete the overlay. It's all gone. We talked about Sandboxie when this was first announced that they'd be open sourcing it. That was episode 17. So we did talk about back then. This is now finally, the source code is actually available now.
Yeah, it's the big news.
Looks like we've used the I think there's a GitHub link.
There is an unofficial GitHub mirror, but it's
that
not,
was just somebody that put it on there. Gotcha.
Yeah, exactly. That's not their official one. And what's really weird is if you go to their official download page for the source, you have to fill out a form for US government export compliance. It's like super weird. I've never heard of export compliance being needed for downloading source code. I can't see this being an actual thing that the government would enforce, or else why would they not do something like that with Geetra's release? I mean, yeah, just, I don't know.
I mean,
really
the only
weird.
thing I can think of is, crypto, something with crypto.
But it's a sandboxing system.
I don't know where it would be used. I'm just saying the only thing I could think of is something with crypto.
Yeah.
And I will mention also, I think the source code will be interesting to look at to see how it handled it. But I mean, now your browser's already people would run their browser, and now browsers have a lot stronger sandboxes now. Just in terms of how they sandbox content, and escaping those is usually through, some sort of kernel code execution. Usually trying to escalate getting system privileges, and I'm going to assume, Sandboxie could also be escaped through that same exploit, so I don't see it as
probably
happening.
Easier.
Yeah, potentially. Or maybe not, because it's something exotic that the attackers won't be thinking of, but...
Security for obscurity?
Yeah.
Rise up.
But I mean, I'll just say, it's not as useful anymore, which is probably why they've decided to open source it. It was a paid program, or Nagware, I think it was. So they're doing something with it, putting the source out. I can applaud that. They're done with it, offloading the application by just putting the source out and letting people do with it what they want. I think that'll be interesting. Obviously now, what you could do with it, you need assigned drivers, so I mean, most people don't have signing certificates for that.
Yeah. I think even though Sandboxie has been made kind of irrelevant by the built-in sandboxes you were talking about, I think studying the source code could be very interesting as a learning exercise, or just, learning a little bit more about how sandboxing works, and the overlay FS or overlay file system stuff could be ported to other projects as well.
Yeah, there are definitely uses for it. Like I said, I'm definitely glad that they're putting it out there and not just hiding it away now that they're done with it.
Yeah. So the source is out there. You can check out that GitHub page that Z was looking at earlier. It is the unofficial mirror, but at the same time, nobody's going to want to fill out a US export compliance form. So just go to the mirror pages. And you can look through the source code there. As far as I know, I think it's all in C and C++. So you're gonna need to have a foundation in that to be able to read the source. But for people who are interested in that, it's there. That being said, though, I think we can move on to some exploits. Unless you have any final thoughts on Sandboxie?
Move on.
Okay, so getting into some exploits, our first one is from ZDI, and it's a ZDI post about a command injection found in Pwn2Own Tokyo from November 2019. It was one from Team Flashback, who was hitting the TP-Link routers. We actually talked about Pwn2Own a little bit on the podcast, and we probably mentioned the surface details of this team and this attack, but this
we usually don't get
details.
All the technical details until afterwards, if we even get them.
Yeah,
it needs to be patched before we get. Yeah.
So this is for TDP server daemon for the TP-Link A7 routers, which apparently runs MIPS. I didn't know routers ran MIPS. I thought MIPS was mostly dead, but that's kind of interesting. I thought, because most routers are probably running ARM, right? So
yeah, ARM's definitely more popular, but I don't really know what the distribution is at all when it comes to type computing.
Yeah. So this daemon seems to be for bridging the gap between their mobile app and the router, which I think is their TP-Link tether app. It could possibly also be for the technicians who come in. You'll notice sometimes they'll have iPads with proprietary apps for interfacing with the router and stuff like that. But it could just be for that TP-Link tether app as well. It wasn't
imagine
totally clear on that.
It's more likely towards that TP-Link tether or some other consumer use, just because of they seem to do the reverse engineering through just looking at the packets.
Yeah.
So unless they had access to the proprietary tooling. I would assume that they use the normal mobile application that's available for consumers to see this.
Yeah, you're probably right. So one of these packet types that you were mentioning that they were reversing can trigger the one mesh service, which ends up parsing a JSON payload that you give to it, which contains like credentials and stuff like that. So the MAC address for the slave device is one of them, and that MAC address is copied to the stack and is then copied into a command buffer through sprintf, which gets passed to system. So you can kind of see there, they go into more detail about all the structs involved and all the functions it passes through. But basically what it ends up boiling down to is the MAC address gets copied into a buffer that's then passed to system, or concatenated into a buffer that's passed to system.
Well, so it placed into it. So it's placed into some Lua code, actually. Which ends up being called by system. But otherwise, you hit the key point there. It sends an encrypted blob of data that uses a static encryption key. And that's where the JSON's contained within. It talks about some of that. It talks about like their custom checksum method. Not entirely relevant to here, as you said. What's relevant, though, is it sends that JSON object that gets decode work, grabs that slave underscore MAC, puts it into a variable, and then here, pulling up the relevant code, you'll see the sprintf that has the system command and has that Lua format. Well, it has the format string for the MAC equals, and then where the MAC will go, call system on it. So it's kind of in the middle of it, and that does come into play with how they actually solve this. But so when I say solve this, one of the problems that they came up with is this looks like it would be a really straightforward command injection. It's calling system, you control some of the data going in there. Straightforward. The problem is that they're limited to about 12 bytes at a time because, the size of a MAC itself, plus their actual escape. So you can escape this as long as it's not doing any validation on the MAC, which it's not. You can escape that with just the quote and semicolon. Which is effectively what they do. They do the single quote to get out of the Lua Lua code, semicolon, and then whatever their payload is, and then they'll kind of recreate the string. Basically, they'll come the last single quote is so the extra characters that are appended don't invalidate the command itself, or don't kind of cause any issues with that. So they get appended onto the end, which is. So coming back to this, they basically had 12 characters, which is not a lot for a command injection.
It's almost like a CTF-like restriction.
Yeah, well, I was thinking like this could be a fun little challenge, or maybe I've even done a challenge like this.
Yeah, probably.
But yeah, their solution there, though, is, printf whatever character appended to another file. Which comes out... File. In their example here, printf a2 file z. Yeah, building up the file one character at a time. That requires 11 bytes, do one character. And then they show how trying to do a character that gets interpreted by the shell. You can't just do that with the printf without quotes. You need a quote, whatever that character is. So you don't have enough bytes left to actually append. So you have to create a new file that you then do a cat with to append it.
I thought it was a pretty clever solution. I liked it.
Yeah, so did I. Like, it wasn't what I was expecting with the ZDI write-up, but definitely fun to read. And I mean, I'd recommend just if just taking a look at how that was done, because I know just hearing me say it probably doesn't quite make sense, but the gist of it is they built up their payload one character at a time, and for some characters they had to take extra steps.
There were some funny crypto fails, I guess, too. The fact that they were all the packets were all encrypted with a fixed key is kind of a problem in itself, but they also had some other weird stuff. They used a really bad initialization vector. If you saw it, it was like ABC or 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 ABCDEFG or something like that. It was really bad. And then they also
seems fine to me. I don't see a problem here.
And they used AES 128, even though they had a 256-bit key and IV. So there was some funny like crypto like weird stuff happening there, but so there's that too in there if anybody wants to look at that. But yeah, overall, I think just the approach of how they handled some of those roadblocks. I think the issue itself isn't too interesting, but how they kind of got around the roadblocks and stuff was what was more value in the post and was pretty fun.
Yeah, I mean,
it
it
talks
is
about a
worth.
fairly trivial bug class and how it can be made harder by the restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, it's made harder. Definitely not impossible. Not like, I mean, I feel like if you were to go and Google like short RCE or short command injection, you'd probably come with some similar things too. Like, I'm definitely not going to say this is a novel vector or a novel method, but at the same time, like I said, it's still interesting to read, and the fact that this is a pwn to own thing. They did get a $5,000 bounty for this.
I saw 20,000.
I think that was kind of the entire thing. This is just one step.
No, I think. Okay, when I read it, it said they got 50,000 total, but 20,000 for this bug. So maybe I misread it.
Yeah, well, so up here at the top, it mentions that which earned them $5,000.
Oh, okay. I went to the Tokyo results and it said 20.
Well, yeah, so they mentioned here, use the command injection vulnerability as part of the exploit chain they used to gain code execution on TP Link Archer. So I assume there was maybe like an escalation or something after this that they also use.
The full chain is 20,000.
Okay. That would be my guess. I mean, it does just say they use this to gain code execution, and in theory, if they have this, they've got code execution already.
Yeah.
But yeah, my guess is probably some sort of escalation or something from there, and this is just part of it.
Yeah, okay. That's pretty interesting. But yeah, I'd recommend reading that just for seeing how they, solve that, the problems they ran into.
Yeah, you could largely, I think, skip towards where that comes up. Like, don't get me wrong, the background's always good. But if you're just interested in that part, like, you don't really need to know a ton of the background here.
Yeah. So we love game exploits just because they're so much fun. You're combining exploits and games, and finally we have one after a little while, and it's in Starcraft 1. Starcraft, the one from 1998. Apparently it was remastered and released in 2017. The bug is fairly old. It was originally patched in 1.13 in January of 2006, but it ended up resurfacing because in the remaster, in 1.21, they introduced an EUD emulator, which basically reintroduced the bug. And the reason it's called the EUD bug is EUD stands for Extended Unit Death, and it was basically a parser bug in the map scripts that allowed relative read-write and basically arbitrary read-write if you factor in where it's reading and writing to.
Parser bug, or just like the one value just wasn't validated. So when it would access an array, so it was a death counter. So you had these death counters that would track like which player, and how many of each type of unit they killed or destroyed or whatever. I haven't played StarCraft, so I apologize if I use some wrong terms. But essentially, you had that. It would use just that unit type wasn't getting validated. So check the player ID, but unit type, you could basically provide any value into this. Actually, I guess it's also important to mention that part of this comes down to the maps kind of supporting some scripting, so people can create kind of their own story or introduce new game modes. And that's where people are able to set up kind of some actions that happen in response to things, like in response to some of the deaths. So in this case, obviously, if you can control one element of the array, like one index, you're able to get to access anywhere in that array. Anywhere kind of in memory if you're able to control that array index.
Yeah, you get that out of bounds access. Yeah.
So you're able to get to increment or compare values and stuff. You're basically, this is, as Spectre already mentioned, a read-write gadget anywhere in memory. No ASLR either on this, so nothing really to deal with there. There was NX, to be fair, but that's about all the security.
There might have been ASLR, but the game wasn't compiled as position independent, so, it doesn't really matter. And that's not too much of a surprise. I mean, the game is pretty old, so I'd probably be surprised if it was position independent. But what I thought was cool about this too was he actually ended up turning this bug into a CTF challenge for the Midnight Sun qualifiers that happened this year. So, it's one of those things that you can see like a game exploit, and those are those are decently common to try to port into CTF challenges, just because it's kind of a unique area. It's not explored too much. You don't see too much about it. So and it's more fun, I think, to exploit games. It kind of brings two things together that makes it a lot more fun.
Yeah, although usually like getting into position to do that is also a bit more of a challenge with the game challenges.
Yeah.
Which I kind of find a little bit more annoying rather than just focusing on the bug, but that's just me.
Yeah. I do have a bit of a question though. Near the end, they said that the bug was exposed in a safe manner, and I'm not really sure what they mean by that. They said old fun custom maps can be played again without exposing yourself to memory corruption attacks. And I don't really see how that's the case, because if the bug survived, then how is it like a safe manner, or how would you not be exposing yourself to memory corruption if this is a memory corruption issue? I'm not really sure what they meant by that. I'm not sure if you kind of...
No, I'm not sure.
Going with that. It's kind of weird the way they worded that. I'm not sure what they were going for there, but yeah, it was just kind of a weird thing I noticed at the end. But overall,
maybe limiting where the bug can actually hit.
Yeah,
like so
maybe.
You can't overwrite the stack with it or something, as they do for ROP.
Yeah, it could be something like that.
Although, I mean, it feels like that's just kind of like that cat and mouse game. Like, there's probably a way around it.
Exactly. So, yeah, it seems kind of weird the way they worded it, but overall, I think the post was really good, and it's fun to see those kinds of attacks instead of the more serious ones we always cover. But getting back into some more serious ones, we have OhMyZsh, which is a .env remote code execution, and it's basically due to falsely trusting environment variables in the .env plugin, or not environment variables, but environment files. So what ends up happening is when you CD into a project directory, this plugin will end up sourcing any environment files it finds in the directory, and it does this without prompting or notifying the user or anything. So,
I believe
if there's a malicious env file, you can get code execution through that.
It's not just it's specifically the .env file, not just like any environment file. It's specifically the .env file in that project. So that's like you would set up your .env file for your project. Automatically when it goes in there, CD in, it just runs source.env for you, and away it goes. Generally helpful. You don't have to remember to do that all the time yourself. That said, source.env, or just using source, the command source, actually executes the file, not just loads environment variables. So if you have a malicious one that has code in it, not just environment variables, it'll execute the code, and it'll do that automatically. So definitely a concern, and definitely like a lot of people would be using this too, because it is useful. I don't use that shell or Z shell or whichever it is, but I do know this is quite popular, especially OhMyZsh shell is quite popular.
I think I've used it before. I don't use it all the
I've used it,
but I've used it.
Yeah, same.
So the fix basically was just to prompt the user to make sure you want to source that environment file when you CD into the directory before just executing it automatically in the background, kind of thing. It's an interesting issue. It's not one you see too often, but it is like it's a very accessible issue. It's not too hard to understand, it's executing this file without letting you know or asking you about it.
I will mention, if I don't really like the fix here, the prompt kind of seems useless.
I can see why you'd say that. Yeah.
I mean, not useless, but excessive at least.
I mean, maybe it should just, I don't know.
My thought was maybe tofu. Like trust on first use, prompt once and then use it. Another thing I was kind of thinking was maybe some sort of pre-scan. Like only look for a very restrictive thing, like if every line is simply alphanumeric equals alphanumeric, no symbols besides that equal sign, something like that, then it could trust it. Although I don't really like that, kind of for the same reason I've mentioned before with the cat and mouse, is there's probably going to be some way around that anyhow. Somebody will figure out some fun CTF like response to it. So I don't really like the pre-scan
or something, for example.
Well, I don't know. I'm just saying somebody can probably find some way around, even if it is really restrictive.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the one way I was thinking you could do that is you could just modify the path file to point to like a directory you control, and kind of like I think there was an issue we talked about last episode that did something like that. They modified the path to prioritize a malicious binary over a usual one, just because they didn't use absolute paths, for example.
Yeah, so you'd probably want to have a check there to make sure that they're not setting path.
Yeah.
For example. So yeah, I think tofu, though, would be a fair compromise, because the compromise they came up with is you could basically disable the prompt if you get annoyed by it. So, I mean, I'd say, that because this is one of those cases where people are going to be prompted by that quite a bit, or potentially could be. So the prompt's going to get annoying, and it's not going to serve its purpose. It's technically there, but it's not going to serve the purpose that was set out for. So that's where I think, if they prompted just on the first use of it, and then trusted it after that, I think that would be a fair way to go about it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. From chat, Pone the Gibson said the Macs are ZSH by default now. Which, yeah, I completely forgot about that, but you're right. I remember the last time it's been a little while, but the last time I went on my Mac, I noticed that too. It is ZSH, so good. That's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. But yeah, kind of a short little write up. It's not a overly complex issue, but it does exist, so wanted to bring it up. We'll get into Symantec web gateway. So there was a white paper on Packet Storm from Cody 16. And it's a nicely laid out paper that has sections on some environment information, bug information. I kind of like how it was laid out. And it's part of a mini series he's doing called Hunting 0 Days, it's kind of like a journal of real world 0 days that he's came across and how he found them and whatnot. It sounds like an interesting concept. And this one covers an RCE in the Symantec web gateway. But the kind of stipulation of that is it can only be hit by authorized users, so the impact is pretty limited there.
It's limited, but at the same time, I mean, you've got a web interface, you don't expect them to have code execution, especially when we're talking about, like, this is something that's going to be used by, like, I believe this is something that would be used more on, like, the enterprise level, and not something that's super consumer focused.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, like, they're going to want to have more protection. Like, it's still something where untrusted people may not have full access, but it still kind of matters.
It's still a privilege escalation.
Yeah. I mean, granted, the type of person who has this level of access probably has access just on the server itself, but no,
and
I mean,
if they
it's
don't, you will be able to track down anybody who exploits this, most likely. Just by checking access logs and stuff like that. But anyway, getting into the issue, it's basically a command injection that was found through the NTP server field in the configuration settings. You searched through the web root of the gateway, did a grep, and found that the NTP server name post variable was just being added right in the middle of a string passed to exec with no validation. So very, like, the most straightforward command injection you can get, basically. We've got a lot of command injections on this show, I just realized.
Yep.
It's that's like our vulnerability class of the week. But anyway, you can basically just use that to get a shell. Issue is fairly straightforward, but I think it's cool that the guy's trying to give some insight into the process. Saying about, like, this is why I did this. We always like to shout those out just because those details
it
are always
included the
interesting to people who
full
are
thought
getting
process.
into it. Yeah, exactly. But the impact is limited because you do need an authorized user to pull it off. But like you were saying, it is still a privilege escalation, and that insight could be helpful. So wanted to give it a bit of a shout out. Our last exploit.
Yeah, and actually, I will just mention,
Yep.
With that, just for those of you listening, it's literally as easy as just injecting a semicolon and putting in whatever command you want to run. That's all you need to do for the injection. Just for those of you listening who can't see how stupidly simple, or how simple this issue is.
Yeah. So our last exploit, we don't have too much information on. It's a VMware security advisory. It's an info disclosure in the VMware directory service. We don't have technical details, but there is a bit of weirdness around it because it has a CVSS3 score of 10. and 9.8 on the CVE, which is very high for what your typical information disclosure would be.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
it might
usually,
be more serious than just a memory leak that could use to,
well, so
defeat
I don't
ASLR.
think this is a memory leak at all.
Okay.
I don't think it's that type of information disclosure. I think this is more likely disclosing some sort of token or even credentials that are used for communication between different services. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
Just because it is a 10.0 or 9.8. Looking at the CVE itself, your CIA or confidentiality, integrity, availability, they're all rated high. Usually with information disclosure, it's just information. So it's just confidentiality, maybe medium, maybe high. But you won't be able to impact integrity or availability of the service. So the fact that that's all being changed there makes me think some sort of authentication or authorization information that could directly be used to modify everything else. Which they kind of mention, it's highly sensitive information which could be used to compromise the vCenter server or other services which are dependent upon VMware for authentication. So yeah, we don't have the details on it, but I figured I'd call it out because I'm sure some of you are in environments using VMware. Yeah. And also just because it is a little bit weird to see an information disclosure with such a high rating.
Yeah, it may be worth patch diffing for anyone interested in doing that kind of stuff. I don't think we want to really, but if you want to see what the actual issue was and get technical details, could be a fun exercise to do some patch diffing on it.
Or there could be a lot of things in there. I don't know how much else would have been patched at the same time.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not too familiar with VMware and like how they roll out updates and stuff, so that's a true point. But it could be something that somebody might be interested in doing. We'll move into some research though. Our first one is on bypassing modern XSS mitigations with code reuse attacks, which is kind of cool. I haven't really heard of code reuse being used in a web context. Apparently, it's been around for a while, since 2017, according to the article.
Yeah, which is still fairly recent. I mean, 2017 is still pretty recent when it comes to research. And yeah, it was actually kind of new to me also. I mean, technically, you've already mentioned this isn't new. But at the same time, it's a little bit different from my usual approach. When dealing with CSP, it's usually looking for some weakness in the CSP header itself that lets you, inject some, defines what object or how you're going to get your code in there. Just some weakness in that. Whereas this dimension is kind of about code reuse. The idea of finding gadgets in existing libraries and reusing those in your injection to get around, like if you have a CSP policy, restricted to only self or something, you'd find some gadget or how to find gadgets in the libraries that are already being used and reusing those for yourself. It's an interesting attack or interesting method.
Yeah, I liked how they had some examples. They have an example of like an HTML page that sets a HTML element with a get parameter, and shows how like the CSP could be bypassed. Their first example is a little bit contrived, but it's something like if the page has a calculator, you can use the expression in that to inject existing page content somewhere else to get that XSS.
Yeah, if they do that, obviously they move right on from talking about that really simple case to using jQuery mobile.
Yeah,
because you include that library, and you're able, and kind of they show a gadget from it. If you go to the 2017 paper, which they link, they include kind of more information about some different gadgets in other libraries.
Mm-hmm. But if you look, they have like some examples of like the gadgets, the types of gadgets you could use to bypass CSP and web application firewalls and stuff like that. So they mention, let me just go to it so I can.
Yeah, well, so string manipulation gadgets, element construction, function creation, JavaScript execution sync gadgets, and gadgets and expression parsers.
Yeah. So, they gave that real world example, and I thought this was really cool because when you hear code reuse, you always think binary. And this kind of makes you rethink that hey, you could use that in the web context as well, and it absolutely makes sense. And it brings kind of that new way of thinking to web, which I always thought I've always found web a little bit boring because it always seems like, okay, copy and paste from a cheat sheet. If it works, okay, cool. If it doesn't, move on to something else. That's how I've kind of seen web for a while. But this kind of challenges that thinking. This is bringing some of that binary thought process into web, which I thought was like really cool. And it was new to me as well. Like, obviously, 2017 is when it was introduced, but it was new to me, and I think you said earlier too, it was new to you as well. So
yeah, so I think it actually, like, 2017 was the first paper on it. I think you can trace this back a little bit further. I couldn't give you dates on it. I think the paper actually gives credit to another source though also.
Oh, okay. But I think it's still like it's probably not very well known. I think maybe we will see the rise of these kinds of attacks in the future.
I think part of it, though, is, I mean, CSPs have been, just increasing in adoption. They haven't been well used in the past.
Yeah.
Or well supported by the browsers either. Like, so that's where I could see this kind of coming up to be more useful. To be thinking about this kind of going forward and having some systems that will maybe remove gadgets from your code automatically. Oh.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was definitely kind of like, you get the concept. Like, as soon as you say bypassing modern excess mitigations with code reuse attacks, like when you mention excess and code reuse, like you kind of get the initial idea of what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
The paper goes into more detail about finding actual gadgets, but yeah, it's not something I've needed to do before or really looked at before, so it was new to me.
One thing I will touch on there is you were saying CSP hasn't seen much adoption, but where I think it's cool too is this can bypass more than just CSP. You can use this to bypass web application firewalls, like they were saying, and I think those have seen increased adoption. I think web application firewalls are like pretty popular now, aren't they? Like, they've picked up a lot of adoption over the last 5 years, haven't they?
I kind of, like, through Cloudflare and through some of the CDN offerings, yes.
So, it could be useful for getting around those, and that could also be spurring on potentially seeing more of this style of attack being used in the future. So, maybe we'll see it in CTFs too. Maybe we could be the first. But yeah, not too much more to say on that.
Yeah, well, on the CTF note, I was actually looking at extending your excessive alert challenge with CSP.
Oh, that could be fun.
I was looking at that, and then I realized that even though you have the includes for the jQuery stuff, you don't actually include the files, so they don't get loaded.
Haha, look at that. Secure. My challenge is secure. But yeah, no, that could be cool. What do you think, like modifying the initial challenge or making a new one?
Well, so my initial thought was to do it like I did with the RNG one, where it's a fixed version.
Yeah, okay.
That's why I was looking at updating your excessive alert one and making it fixed or less excessive alerts.
Hey, that could be fun. I think that's a good idea. But with that, we'll move on to our next research topic. So our next one is practical data poisoning attacks against next item recommendation. So this paper proposes a system called Loki, guessing, the god of tricks and Norse mythology. That's probably where they came up with the name, because I couldn't find. It doesn't seem to be an acronym, and it's this system is being proposed for doing data poisoning attacks against black box recommendation systems. And what I mean by recommendation systems is shopping sites, for example, where they recommend items to you based on reviews and purchase history. And the example they go through with is Amazon, basically. And their system is going to use machine learning to train the attack agent. And how they do that is by using a simulator to get around the restrictions you'd have with typical real-world recommendation systems. So they basically run a simulator with a data set. So the example they use is like the Amazon beauty products section. They take like a bunch of those and basically make a simulator for that recommendation system. And then they try to poison that system. Which uses a history of like the user's actions and stuff like that to discern interests and make connections between them. And the key paragraph that summarizes what they're doing, for some reason I forgot to write down the page number, so I don't know if you could search for this while I'm talking about it. But they say the intuition behind such a design is that if two recommenders can both get similar recommendation results in a given data set, then the adversarial samples generated for one of the recommenders can be used to attack the other. So to pull off this attack, They assume the attacker can see the full history of all the users in the system. They assume they can inject a limited number of controlled users, and that they're hitting a black box system, and that the attacker can only receive minimal feedback. They can't see, for example, when the target model is retrained. So for testing this, they tested against like the Amazon beauty products, like I was talking about before.
Yeah, I do want to jump in and just mention that I do feel like one of those things, the access to the full activity full activity history of all users in the recommendation list.
That is a high condition.
That seems like a really high condition. Everything else seems like they're taking it as like, what can somebody outside do? The limited number of control users, not knowing the details, limited feedback. That one just seems so out of place for everything else. Like not knowing the details about the target system, but they know the full activity history.
It does kind of go against their black box approach, yeah.
Yeah, like everything else seems okay. Just that one. Like, I'm not sure if maybe I was just misunderstanding how they were using that or something, but that one really stood out to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a bit weird. But, when they did their testing, they ended up seeing that they could force a display rate of up to 0.5 at 15 activities per user. And those are fairly decent results. I mean, 50% is quite a lot if you're hitting something like Amazon, for example. So, it's kind of interesting hitting like recommendation systems and using machine learning, kind of using AI to attack AI in a way. I think that's kind of cool. But like you were saying, that is a good point, though, that, that is a very high conditional considering their whole methodology behind the paper is being able to hit black box systems. So, yeah, that is a bit weird.
Yeah, that's why I wasn't sure if maybe I was misunderstanding and they only needed like the full history of their controlled subjects or something like that. But it does say
all users.
Of all users, yeah.
So, that's a good point. Overall, though, I thought the paper was kind of interesting. So, wanted to bring it up. Our next paper, though, I think is far more interesting. And it's on the defense side. And it's about hardware Trojan detection using controlled circuit aging. So how they propose to do that is basically using transistor aging to try to detect hardware backdoors and Trojans. So this paper is pretty technical. It gets into the hardware level, but essentially what they're proposing is that when the voltage of a transistor goes from high to low, it causes short-term aging in that transistor. And when this happens, the current that goes through it is reduced, which causes a switching delay, which delays timings and causes timing errors in the integrated circuits. And what they do is use machine learning to try to learn the bit error patterns produced from a known clean IC, and then they do the same thing against a potentially malicious IC and compare the results.
I mean, maybe I was just distracted for a moment, missed it, but one of the big things is with the aging, that they're using both the aging result, so I'm sorry, did you mention the aging aspect?
I mentioned the aging aspect. I didn't go too far in depth with it, though.
Okay.
So
I don't want to go too far in depth with it. I was just going to make mention of effectively they find a way to artificially age the circuit, and then they use also overclocking to kind of result in some higher delays when doing that. And then it's the difference that they're finding, like the difference in those bit flips, the difference in the errors that happen. When there's a Trojan versus when there's not a Trojan.
Checking for side effects, basically.
Yeah, and I thought this was an interesting paper, not because I totally understood everything here, but because this is an issue that I've not really thought about. Obviously, it exists, it matters. It's not in an area that I deal with. Like, I don't deal with hardware at all. It's not an area I'm really knowledgeable in. But it is an area that, like, it matters. It's not something I've thought about, but it was still kind of interesting to see, like, this is what they're doing and this is what they're thinking about in terms of trying to detect those hardware implants, those Trojans.
Yeah. I mean, getting into some results, when they tested their setup, they ended up testing against some Trojan circuits from TrustHub. So they provide like Trojan circuits for testing for like these kinds of projects. And they tested against 3 circuits, the basic RSA T100, the AES T100, and the AES T1000. And when they tested, they ended up finding that they had a 99% detection rate against those circuits. So it seems to be like really promising in how accurate it is. That being said, they did only test against those 3 benchmarking circuits. So it is pretty limited. It would be cool to see it its results against other circuits, though I know that's pretty difficult. Like getting your hands on Trojan, like known Trojan circuits is probably not too easy to do. So I don't blame them for that, but just know that that test result set is a little bit limited. So you might want to take that 99% figure with a grain of salt. It's a long paper.
Otherwise, though, that 99% is a very good result.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's a long paper. It goes pretty low level. Like obviously you're dealing with hardware stuff, but hardware stuff is always fun to talk about because it's almost like dark magic in a way. A lot of people don't really understand some of the implications that can happen at that level, and using stuff like voltage and current and overclocking and stuff like that to detect these errors and bit flips. Like it's such a low level that like 99% of people do not think about. And that's what kind of makes it cool. It highlights the fact that with hardware, even the most benign things can hold valuable information, which is why it's such an interesting research area. So, definitely wanted to bring that up. It's it's a very fun paper. But it is like, it's not incredibly accessible. You can get that higher level view like we did, but unless you're like familiar with hardware and the math and some of the science at that lower level, you might struggle getting some of the more intricate details of it. Just as a fair warning, I guess. Did you have any final thoughts on that paper though, Z?
No, I mean I didn't even try to get the deeper understanding of it, to be honest.
Fair enough.
I took this as it's an interesting area. I haven't seen much on this. Got the high level understanding of what's going on, but I didn't even try to dig too deep into it.
Yeah. So we'll move on to our final topic, and it's aptly named a final security bug. You're bringing up DuckDuckGo? Okay.
I brought that up because you accidentally brought this paper up when you switched topics. Don't worry about it.
Oh, fair enough. So it describes a bug in Google Tink's EUD 25519 Java implementation, which allows attackers to extract private keys.
Really important to mention this. This did not make it into the release version of Tink, which is their kind of easy-to-use crypto library. Significant bug, did not make it into an actual thing, so like no impact. It was actually found like in 2017 and patched in 2017.
Yeah.
This is the first time it's being written up. I believe he's presenting about this actually at some conference. Because I saw this come up on my iCar feed. The cryptography feed. So I think there's some crypto conference that this will be presented at.
If the conference happens. It's very possible we see it canceled. Maybe, yeah. But they first describe EUD 25519, which I haven't really heard of, but it's basically an Edwards curve digital signature algorithm, which uses SHA-256 and curve 25519. That's where those digits come from there. They praise it quite a bit. They say it was designed with excellent security engineering consideration. So, it seems to be strong.
The guy writing this from Google Tink is from Google. I feel like there might be some bias here. That said, I can't really say that they're not. Yeah. That said, like I Google definitely hires good people, so I'm gonna assume it's true. Like I'm just kind of pointing that out in jest more than out of any sort of serious issue with anybody involved.
Yeah. So the issue is not a bug that's a design flaw in the algorithm. It's actually in the implementation, and the issue is when they sign the message. They pass the message, the public key, and the hash private key, and these arguments should not be changed by the callee function. And this is signaled by using the final keyword. The problem is these parameters are arrays, and the contents of these arrays can be changed without raising errors, even though it's declared as final, because they kind of misunderstood how final worked.
Well, so it's more. I actually even want to put the blame more towards Java on this one. So if you're a C programmer, you're familiar const char star, constant character array, pointer. But when you use that, the array itself, the contents of it, you can't modify it. That's the idea of using the constant. Java doesn't have any equivalent to that. Java has this final, which if you're not intimately familiar with Java, you'd be forgiven for thinking it's the same thing as const, but it's not. As Spectre was saying, it ends up protecting. It basically is saying like you can only assign a value to this variable or this field once. So it assigns the pointer value basically for the array. It doesn't actually protect the content of it, just kind of that initial pointer assignment for it. And that's kind of how Java does it. So as he's mentioning in mul_add, which just does like a basic or like a modular arithmetic on it, that ends up, it passes in the hash private key twice to that function, which ends up modifying the message. And I'll let you kind of get back to what you were saying.
Yeah, the issue is because the callee can modify the parameter, it ends up modifying the hash private key, and the first 32 bytes of that key is published. And that means if you get two messages signed with the same key, you can compute the private key by using an equation to eliminate the modifications that were done to the hash private key. So they have, I think page 4, they have some of those equations that you could use. Obviously, I'm not a crypto person, I'm not a math major, so I don't fully understand these equations. But the fact is, you can end up calculating the differences. It's a cool paper. It is it's pretty mathy, like some of the previous papers we've covered.
It is. I mean, the key thing, though, is just that final aspect. Like the fact that the values are getting modified and ends up reusing this modified value. So the first time through, it calculates the signature correctly. The second time through, that hash private key is actually saved. It's kind of cached. And that's where that second time through, because it got modified, it ends up using a different value, and then you kind of figure things out from there. So it does go into the math, but really the key thing there that I thought was interesting was just the fact the issue was this trust in final, which is where I kind of come down on Java for not having something equal to the constant in like C++ and C.
I think I'd agree with that. Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's cool, right? Like it just shows like even if you're like a super smart person who's like really good with crypto, when you're getting into the implementation level, even if it's done by experts in the field, it's still very easy to make very subtle mistakes. And that ends up getting an attacker essentially an oracle into your crypto, which is not something you ever want them to have.
Something that was mentioned here was even doing the standard tests. So using like all the standard test cases wouldn't have discovered this and didn't discover this. Because the standard test would just check like, okay, is the signature just running it once? Does the signature result correctly?
Yep.
And it would. The first time it would work, so the implementation was okay.
Yeah, it kind of lends credence to that fact that, especially when you're talking about crypto and a library that is from somebody like Google that a lot of people are going to use, you're probably going to want to write your unit tests more, like you want to test with a lot more edge cases and try to be more aggressive in testing, I guess, on that. Because if they were, they might have caught this issue. You know what I mean?
Well, they did catch this issue, to be fair.
They might have caught it earlier, I guess.
But to be fair, like this was, again, I'll repeat, this was caught pre-release. This was an audit being done before they released it, so it was caught. But like it could have been caught during development, doing more tests at that point. And I would imagine they immediately added in a regression test to cover this anyhow.
Yeah. So, this is a really cool insight into, crypto stuff, which again, like hardware, is kind of like a dark magic area. So definitely a fun read. I wanted to bring up from chat. Sorry for the off topic. How are you all doing during the quarantine? I don't know. How are you doing? See,
and that's
I know you kind of already live in the middle of nowhere.
I don't know how to quite say like, and I'm very much in the middle of nowhere. I think there was, as far as I know, like the closest cases to me, there might be one in town. There were 3 like a half hour from me, and otherwise like most of the outbreaks been 2 hours or 3 hours away from me in kind of like the big cities near here. We're already down to the point where we have more people recovered than than active cases, so quarantine's been pretty fine for me.
You've been practicing for years. You've been self-isolated for a while.
Yeah, all the hiking there. It's just I'm used to being on my own.
Yeah. I mean, in my case, I'm in a town that is a little bit more populated. It's not like I don't live in like Toronto or something, so it's not crazy. But it has kind of sucked just not being able to, go out anywhere. I like to go out for walks and stuff like that. I have been doing some of that, but I don't go as far and I don't go anywhere. I have to walk around people and practice the social distancing. It's very weird, and it does kind of suck not being able to go out and do stuff, especially where it's getting warmer now. This ground isn't covered in snow. At the same time, though, a lot of the stuff I do is online, so I guess I'm kind of lucky in that regard. It's not like I go shopping and stuff a ton, so I'm not as
don't need to
affected
go
as some people
looking
are.
for new shoes.
I don't go
Just casual
shoe shopping
like
every
that.
2 weeks. No.
Razzie Wu mentions we're locked down until April 30th. The digital passes to go outside for hour at a time. Digital passes, it sounds like some high-tech country doing that.
I've heard of that, and I have some. I'm not happy with some of the direction. I'm less worried about the quarantine and self-isolation aspects from this as much as I'm worried about the technical advancements that are being made that are very privacy invasive, which I think we will end up talking about and do a video on a little bit later. But I'm very concerned about the privacy implications of some of the stuff that's coming out of this.
This is something that governments can definitely jump at to push through laws that maybe wouldn't get pushed through otherwise, similar to kind of 9/11 in the US.
Yep.
Kind of getting things through there. I could definitely see that going on. I mean, the Canadian government tried to pass some fairly unrestricted payment, or not payment, I can't think of the right words to use here, which...
Being able to use funding without, like, approval.
Yeah, without needing much oversight on it for quite a while.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, I'll go into more detail on the video we do about it, but overall, like, my problem is a lot of this technology that's coming out of, trying to protect people, this technology is not going to be put back in the box. History's shown us that,
No, I mean, once it's out, it's out. Because you're talking about contact tracing, yeah?
That's the main one, yeah. So, we'll do a video on that, do some videos on that, but, that is a little bit concerning for me. That's probably the most concerning aspect of the COVID stuff for me.
Yeah, fair enough.
That being said, we'll move into some shoutouts. I do have one, last-minute shoutout I added, and that's OhMyZsh. They say RCEed version. I think they mean REed version. But it's basically somebody ended up reversing Stuxnet and basically rewriting it into source code. So, Stuxnet is probably the biggest, worm or Trojan that's ever been, talked about in history. It's very interesting and it's a very complex malware, and, reversing it took AV guys and stuff months to do. So the fact that it's been reversed and rewritten, I think that could be very cool to look at for people. Obviously Stuxnet, that was from 2008. It's pretty old now, but it still might be interesting for people who want to look into how that stuff works. It doesn't seem like the repository has a license. They say both of our licenses are extremely permissive. You can do anything you want with the code provided. We just ask that you give us credit, basically.
So there's no license file, but the files themselves, I just pulled up one of the C files here, has the license in it.
Yeah, it's under GNU GPL. Okay. Yeah, fair enough. So yeah, the repo doesn't have one, but the files do. Okay. So yeah, they're under the GPL license. So, I think, obviously I don't think you should use this because I don't know why you would use this outside of a malicious context. But I think it could be a really interesting study for people who are interested in malware and stuff like that.
I mean, personally, I just like to run rootkits. I mean, it's a hobby.
Just for fun, yeah.
It's like the there's an XKCD.
There's always an XKCD for every scenario, I think.
They're tracking their virtual Windows machines networked together, hooked up, to track kind of all the viruses coming through.
That looks like a Hollywood sketch on the top left. Looks like something you see in a movie, yeah. But yeah, just wanted to shout that out because I haven't looked into it too much, but I know this will definitely be interesting to some of our listeners out there, so wanted to put that out. Do you have any final thoughts on anything in the show, Z, that you wanted to bring up before we...
No, I think we're good to end.
Okay, cool. we'll wrap up the show here. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. You can catch the VODs on Twitch or on YouTube 24 hours after the stream. And you can check previous podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and links on our Anchor. If you want to get involved in the community, we have a Discord, and you can follow us on Twitter for updates for any streams or videos we do. But outside that, we will be back again next Monday at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific, and we will see you guys then.